Hey everyone, welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica. I want to do one more follow-up video to this divine wrestle, be reconciled, let God prevail video. I had already done one where we looked at the mandrake symbolism, where this pertains to Rachel's story and her wrestle with the divine. And tonight I want to do a textual analysis and look a little bit more at Jacob's divine wrestle. So in this table, this comes from a paper that we're going to look at where it shows a Hebrew wordplay happening, and this is how we are able to identify that this is a ritual embrace, that it's not just Jacob literally wrestling with an angel or a messenger physically, but that there's also a spiritual aspect to this, or a ritual aspect. And it comes from this Hebrew wordplay. So when people have a hard time identifying the temple texts or the temple liturgy in text, this is probably why. It's because in order to see that, you really do need to understand Hebrew. I don't, so I'm very grateful for scholars who do. And this is where great scholarship helps. So for example, in this table, you can see we have the names Jacob, Israel, Peniel, which is the place that Jacob named where this took place, and then we have the name Enos. And they're comparing something that was happening with Enos in the Book of Mormon to what happened with Jacob. Remember, Enos had a divine wrestle as well. It was a wrestle of mighty prayer, and he's praying for forgiveness. He's seeking the Lord's will in his life, and he goes through what looks like a little bit of an ascension process. So for example, here you have the Hebrew meaning of Enos, man, poetic. Then on level 1, we have Enos 1:1, where we see just man, the idea there being taught. And then going on in Genesis 32:24, we have just kind of echoing the same idea of Enos's name. There's this idea of a man, and then also men. And this is happening in the book of Genesis. So you see that, Genesis 3:28. And then we have with Jacob, there's his name meaning may he, God, protect. And then we've got this level 1, level 2, level 3 wordplay. And you can see this progression of ideas happening here. So he starts out on the heel. This pertains to when he was born and he was like grabbing the heel of his brother Esau. Then it goes on to talk about this wrestle and then this embrace. And so there's like a progression. And you see that with the name Israel too. We see the struggle with God. Then we see like struggle or have power with God. So we're having power, like being enabled. And then there's strugglings. And then there's this idea of seeing God's face. And so all of these are Hebrew word plays that help you identify that something's happening here. And you see this connection to Enos. So there's a Book of Mormon connection there. Now, there's no way Joseph Smith could have written this, okay? It's just not possible. And I think that the best Book of Mormon evidence is not the geography, it's stuff like this. It's the textual analysis. So let's look at this. Peniel is another one. We see that happening here. There's a link to Enos. We see this idea of the face of God, face to face with God, and then a similar idea going on there in the Book of Mormon. So now I want to, we're going to look at those verses in Genesis 32, and I'm not going to read them, but I want to point out a couple of things. So remember how Jacob, he sends his family over that brook called Jabbok. Jabbok represents chaos. It's kind of like a little, I don't know, think about like the primordial waters, or like crossing over that chaotic sea. There's that idea there. He has 11 sons at this point. He does not have Benjamin. 11 is a number that also represents chaos. And it doesn't become that full total priesthood until the 12th son is born, and that's Benjamin. So there's a couple of ideas happening there with his family, but we're going to dig into that word Jabbok because it's also a Hebrew word play with Jacob. And notice how similar they are even in English, but the Hebrew words are even more similar. And then we're going to look at this idea of that's noted in verse 25, where it says, and when he saw that he prevailed not against him, the angel or this messenger, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him. This is an important part of Jacob's story, so we're going to dig into that a little bit. And it reminds me a bit of the thorn in the flesh. So I actually linked this to 2 Corinthians. If you look at 2 Corinthians in this chapter, Paul, he's caught up to the third heaven. He has this vision, and he talks about how God gave him a thorn in the flesh. And even though he appealed to God 3 times, asking him to remove this, so you can see there in verse 8, it says, "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me." The Lord responds to him, and he says, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And he talks about how he takes pleasure in his infirmities, in his reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake, because when he's weak, then he's strong. And that's kind of the theme that I hope you'll think about as we dive into Jacob's story, because that is what's happening here. This is the path of the disciple, the path to exaltation. This is how we come to see the face of God. And God gives us our weakness that we might be strong. And that's what you'll see in Jacob's story as we dig into this textual analysis. And I hope you'll see the ascension process and the endowment happening here. So we're going to look at some scholarship. There's an article. It's by Jeff Bradshaw. It's part of a series he did where he's just building on the works of Hugh Nibley. It was published in the Interpreter Foundation. It's called "A Wrestle with an Angel and the Promise of a New Name at Jabbok." They summarize different scholarship. They point out that Jacob's transformation happens here, and that we see this in the Hebrew wordplay. And it says that in the biblical account, the word embraced constitutes a paronomasia on the name Jacob, similar to the paronomasia on wrestle. Notice how the words are so similar in Hebrew, just a couple of vowels are changed around and consonants. And Jacob. This wordplay is a sublime pun on Jacob that emphasizes his transformation from his former identity. He's no longer the heel grabber or usurper, but the embraced, the at-one or atoned. This pun confirms Hugh Nibley's suggestion that the word conventionally translated as wrestled can just as well mean embraced. They point out another scholar who's citing that the very name of the brook where the event took place, Jabbok, also participates in the word play. So notice Jacob and Jabbok in Hebrew, they're so similar. We've got Yaakov and Yabok, and they're spelled so similarly. And so this is that Hebrew word play. This is a literary device to help you gain these insights and see these deeper meanings. And so Jabbok means passed over the ford Jabbok. So he summarizes the complex Hebrew artistry in the table, which we looked at. And they noted the affinities that it had with Enos in the Book of Mormon. And then I'm going to kind of skip over some of this commentary. It's a really great article, but I just want to keep this video as short as I can. But Andrew C. Skinner, he had commented that it seems reasonable to conclude that Jacob's wrestle was physical as well as spiritual because the text is emphatic in its description of Jacob's dislocated hip. He says perhaps that detail is mentioned precisely to show that his wrestle was a literal as well as a metaphoric occurrence, and then it's reasonable to suppose that Jacob's opponent that night was a being from an unseen world, a heavenly messenger, a divine minister, possessing a tangible but translated body because he was able to wrestle all night and throw Jacob's hip out of joint. So this opponent was very strong, and he was testing Jacob physically and spiritually. The spiritual nature of the wrestle is very important. They linked this to Alma 8:10, where Alma labored much in the spirit, wrestling with God in mighty prayer. And they kind of pose some food for thought there of how we wrestle with God. Does God resist you? Do you have to resist him? And then they note that you have to put yourself in position just like you do in like an actual wrestling match. And I thought that was kind of an interesting idea there. So Jacob's wrestle being both physical and spiritual, this is a way for the messenger to test his strength and his character. And there's a ritual aspect to this encounter, just like there is for us in mortality. It's like that mortal test. We need to stay true and faithful. And that's what Jacob is trying to do here. So when one considers that the word conventionally translated by wrestled can just as well mean embrace, and that it was this ritual embrace that Jacob received a new name and the bestowal of priestly and kingly power at sunrise, the parallel to the Egyptian coronation embrace becomes at once apparent. So they're noting that Egyptian kind of like temple ritual also has a similar type of embrace. So then they cited how here in Genesis 32:25, when he saw that he had prevailed not against him and he touched the hollow of his thigh. So one scholar translates the hollow of his thigh as his hip socket. So they say that touch can also mean to barely touch. And they noted that this is kind of like the concept of a magic touch, or like putting your finger on a skillful pressure point. And kind of going along this line of this hollow of his thigh, they noted that this also shows that through just other scholarship that had been done, I'm just going to kind of skim over it, but basically that his leg comes out of like the hip joint, like the socket of the hip, and so this becomes a permanent injury to him. Andrew Skinner, he noted some really good scholarship too. So first they summarize all of this kind of mainstream Christian scholarship that sort of gives you like, I guess, primary level understanding of it. Just in Jacob's name, that he used to be a little bit devious, how he supposedly tricked Esau out of his birthright. Even though it's really more of a trial, because we see, it'll explain here, but basically Isaac was standing in the way of what Rebecca knew needed to happen, which was that Jacob received the birthright. And so they had to find a way to overcome that. And Skinner pointed out, and Andrew C. Skinner, he's a really good LDS scholar, by the way, he's been around forever, he's got lots of great stuff, but he said that you can see the temple symbolism here because Jacob was asked for his name and he disclosed his own given name to a divine messenger minister. So think about the temple when you use your own given name. Then Jacob was presented with a new name. Think about the temple when you receive a new name. Jacob was next given, or perhaps better promised, an endowment of power, which would be recognized in the eyes of both God and men. So he's promised a future endowment of power if he remains true and faithful. Very, very much like the temple endowment and the temple rituals that we do. So Jacob, he's one whose life's entangled in moral ambiguities, a lot like ours. And we have a scholar here who noted, it will no longer be said that the blessings came to you through deviousness, which is akba, a word suggested by the radical of crookedness in the name Jacob, but instead through lordliness, which is sarera, a root that can be extracted from the name Israel, and openness. It's nevertheless noteworthy that the pronouncement about the new name is not completely fulfilled, whereas Abraham is invariably called Abraham once the name is changed from Abram. The narrative continues to refer to this patriarch in most instances as Jacob, an explanation for the fact that this supposed name change did not really take effect until later is offered in Jewish Midrash. Apparently at Jabbok, Jacob received a new name only in anticipation of a new name he would receive later from God. This is very similar to what we experience. The scholar goes on, for later on, the Holy One, blessed be he, will reveal himself to you in Bethel. See Genesis 35:10. There he will change your name and bless you. Another midrash adds, in the messianic time, however, the name Jacob will be given up entirely, and only Israel, or rather the real permanent new name represented by Israel in an anticipatory mode, will remain. So that's kind of interesting. It's saying that Israel is representative of an ultimate future name that Jacob will be given. So the names with El, like in Israel, ending that way, they generally make God the subject, not the object, according to one scholar, of the verb in the name. This particular verb, Sarah, is a rare one, and there's some question about its meaning, though an educated guess about the original sense of the name would be God will rule, or perhaps God will prevail. Another scholar had noted with regard to the verse 29 that says, and Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? The scholar comments, the man now implicitly identified with God refuses to give his name lest it be abused. And this is so similar to the temple. Again, we're seeing how there are some things that are sacred that cannot be revealed outside of the temple. Then he disappears in the dark as suddenly as he came, and he blessed him there. And then Andrew C. Skinner had remarked, the text is silent about the nature of the additional blessing. But Sarna, among others, seems to provide a better reading when he translates the phrase as, he took leave of him there. Thus, we're left in doubt as to whether Jacob received or not at that time either the new name he sought or the blessing he had requested. Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I've seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. That's in verse 30. Nibley reads, and Jacob called the place Peniel, the face of El, because I have seen Elohim face to face, and my spirit has been saved. And then Penuel is just another term for Peniel. And the story kind of ends with Jacob rising up. He's the patriarch who's crossing back into his native land. So this is kind of like a homecoming idea there. Very, very similar to the temple. Like when you pass through the veil, and the idea is you're going back into the presence of God. So then they pointed out too how we're reminded that he still has this injury in verse 21 where it says he halted upon his thigh. They point out that in Jewish tradition, this unique and cryptic term for the thigh muscle with the sciatic nerve is what's being referenced there. And so we see that Jacob has this limp and he's badly injured. He goes on this way for the rest of the story. And it says, Jacob, this is another scholar, Jacob, whose name can be construed as he who acts crookedly, is bent permanently lamed by his nameless adversary in order to be made straight before his reunion with Esau. And remember that this was a huge test for Jacob. He was nervous about going to try to reconcile with Esau. Esau wanted to kill him, and that's why Jacob ended up leaving. And he's got to return home, and the Lord's telling him he needs to reconcile with his brother. Rachel had to reconcile with her sister, and they both had to overcome these struggles and these wrestlings that they were having with God and with man. But they overcome. And Jacob does reconcile with his brother Esau. And then President Nelson had noted the significance of this wrestle that Jacob has and the transformation that he has. And another scholar had noted that Jacob may well have been called Israel Jacob, which he said means Jacob shall rule or let Jacob rule. And he says in every confrontation, he's emerged as the victor over Esau, over Isaac, over Laban. And startlingly, during the divine encounter at Jabbok, he attempted to prevail in his conflict with God, but after God's answer to the deceiver Jacob, whereby God's sovereignty and faithfulness to his promise despite all human unworthiness is demonstrated, Jacob's no longer the strong, victorious controller of the divine, but Israel, who is totally dependent on God's grace and lame. Doesn't that sound a lot like Paul's thorn in the flesh? Speaking of this crucial turning point in the life of Jacob, President Nelson said, through this wrestle, Jacob proved what was most important to him. He demonstrated that he was willing to let God prevail in his life. In response, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, meaning let God prevail. God then promised Israel that all the blessings that had been pronounced upon Abraham's head would also be his. Anyway, I love this story, and I love seeing this temple symbolism and finding that temple ritual in the scriptures. I feel like I'm so grateful for the scholarship that we have, and I'm most especially grateful for the restoration, the restored church, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and for the temple so that we can find and see these lessons in scripture. And there's just so much more that we have because of the restoration that we're able to see through things like these Hebrew literary devices. So I'm grateful for the gospel, grateful for the restoration, and I hope that was fun and a little extra to chew on.